Hey, this is Mac, and welcome to Intro to Rendering with V-Ray for Rhino. In this course, we're going to cover the essentials of rendering in Rhino using V-Ray. We'll go over 4 common scene templates that are rendered in Rhino so that you can master this very specific visualization workflow and create images at any scale and for any context. My hope is that no matter what type of creative you are, this course will help you master new ways of designing and representing your ideas. But before we begin the course exercises, I first want to cover the fundamentals of designing an effective rendered image. Think of this video as a preface to this course. We're going to briefly discuss the elements needed to have your images stand on their own and tell an engaging story or make a compelling argument. The thing is, creating a compelling image isn't just about mastering CG tools or becoming a Rhino or V-Ray expert. In fact, you could be the most technically advanced CG artist, but not have these ingredients in your renders, and your images would suffer as a result. It's important to remember that while creating renders is a technical undertaking, it also requires artistic skill that isn't entirely computer-based. So in this video, we're going to cover those key ideas, and then use the rest of this course to unpack the technicalities involved in creating renders. Let's start with the ingredients needed to make a good image. As a whole, an image should carry with it an idea, an argument, some sort of reference, or really just any meaning that isn't just a render for render's sake. Anyone can master rendering tools. It's about the ideas you communicate through these tools that make your images valuable. So in this sense, we should treat each image as a tool to communicate an intent or idea. Always decide this before beginning to design your image. After deciding this, setting up a composition that communicates this intent or idea follows. And in order to craft a successful composition in our render, we need the following variables: detail, order, proportion, balance, and hierarchy. While this is by no means an exhaustive list, these are key factors I always have in the back of my mind when I'm setting up an image to render and design the composition of a scene. To better explain these variables and how they support different ideas, I'm going to share some references that I personally draw much inspiration from. Whenever I start a project, I go to many of these references for inspiration, and I encourage you to do the same with your own personal list of references. And just a note that not all of these are renders, but nevertheless demonstrate the tricks and tools we need to create compelling images. Let's talk details. I use this term to refer to the amount of visual information defining each object in an image. An image with excellent attention to detail illustrates each item with care, regardless of the position or scale in the scene. The first example we'll go over are the prison drawings by Piranesi. These drawings were all imagined by Piranesi, which is to say, they are not depictions of existing scenes, but they become believable and inhabitable images through their rigorous attention and care in drawing out every visible aspect of every object in the scene. Similarly, these images by Brodsky and Utkin demonstrate incredible attention to detail. Like the Piranesi references, these are made as etchings rather than renders. Regardless of the medium, the exceptional level of detail in these etchings allows us to inhabit them as entirely complete worlds. Every aspect of the images is thought out and complements the composition as a whole. We should aim to achieve this level of detail when rendering. One final thing to note when looking at these images is that detail is not just about accuracy or representing an object, but also about scale and intricacy. At every scale and part of these images, attention and care is given to their illustration. It is not about modeling and rendering one thing perfectly, but rather about building out each and every component of the scene to make a complete image. The next category, order, refers to the visual structure and arrangement of the image. An image with a clear order is one that is legible and direct. Order can be achieved through color palette, geometry of forms, and position of objects within the image. In these examples, we can see varying types of order achieved by the image's authors. The first example is Boulet's design for A Cenotaph for Newton. In this example of order, these images can be read as assemblages of bold forms to create a cohesive composition. In these images, order functions to direct us to a certain focal point or area of emphasis in the image. The central dome where Boulet imagined Newton's grave to be positioned is the emphasis of these images. And to emphasize this, Boulet positions this at the center of the frame, then uses smaller forms on each side of the dome to draw the direction of the eye to the center of the image. It's a very clever use of order to draw our attention to what matters most in the image. 2 additional references that I'll share that are outside the world of CGI design and architecture, but are still very relevant when discussing order. The films of Stanley Kubrick and Wes Anderson. These directors are famous for their rigorous, symmetrical framing throughout their movies. Kubrick and Anderson's cinematographic styles each use order to direct the audience's attention to the intended area or focus of the screen. Each offers instances in which order is used to make a nuanced statement through subtle visual structuring of a scene. When constructing an image with clear order in mind, these guys are great references. Moving on to our next variable, let's discuss the element of proportion in image making. Proportion refers to the relationship of forms to each other within the image. Forms should live in visual equilibrium, which is to say any contents that you want the viewer looking at should be complementary to each other in terms of scale. When discussing proportion in an image, this refers to a number of objects in the scene that make up a comparative whole. The architects of the French Enlightenment provide us with great examples of proportion. Ledoux's series of houses he drew for various types of workers demonstrate the importance of proportions when designing images. The part-to-whole relationship between the architectural elements creates a synthesized complete whole. Our attention is drawn to the complete object rather than to one specific detail over another, because the proportions of the elements are complementary to each other. For example, in the case of the water inspector's house, the plinth or base of the house is 1/2 of the total form. The remaining half is the vault, which directs the eye upwards, while the water that pours through it draws the eye back downward to the remaining scene of the image. These carefully constructed proportions create a harmonious image that reads both in pieces and as a complete whole. One other artist who makes clever use of proportion is Thomas Demond. Demond is known for recreating scenes from history or contemporary events with construction paper, creating super precise models of the spaces and then photographing them to simulate the real space of the event. Demond works in model scale, which is to say he's not working at 1-to-1 scale when building these models and photographing them. In doing so, he exercises total control over the part-to-whole relationship of the objects in the scene. The placement of each object in the model is precise and purposeful. In this sense, proportion is not only about scale and relationships, but also about translation. Demond translates the scale of the objects into model size, then photographs them to obscure their true scale. The immersive quality of his images lies in his control of proportions, a useful tool to remember when creating our own work. Now this brings me to our next point, the variable of balance. For this, I'm going to briefly discuss a CG artist whose work I really admire, Max Guthrie. Guthrie's work is super successful for a number of reasons. However, I think the element of balance really makes his composition stand out. Guthrie achieves balance through color, texture, and form. Guthrie is very careful to arrange the objects in his scene so that there is a compositional harmony in form and color palette. He uses parallel projection instead of perspective to further enhance this balance. I recommend checking out more of his work if you're looking for inspiration or even just curious about the variety of representational styles that CG artists can take on. We've arrived at our last point, hierarchy. Creating hierarchy in your work is really important when you want to emphasize certain moments in your image or draw attention to certain details. Hierarchy plays an important role in telling the narrative or argument your image is trying to convey. First, I'll talk about Takeshi Murata's work, as I believe he uses hierarchy in interesting ways to tell the story of his images. In many of his images here, we see Murata building up his composition through layers of information or objects. Nothing sits on a flat plane or is dropped into the scene as is. Rather, objects are arranged like islands in a sort of archipelago of visual information. We are able to read these objects through the carefully layered hierarchy that Murata has set up. Alright, that brings us to the end of our introduction. I encourage you to keep these topics in the back of your mind while you're moving through the course exercises. And feel free to even come back and rewatch if you need a refresher. And with that, let's begin our introduction to V-Ray for Rhino.